Hi, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's call. We're really excited to have everyone here and appreciate you taking the time out of what I'm sure is a busy day. And we're very excited to about the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Which, for some context, David and I have been working on this for David longer than me, going on 8 years with the company, but in my own experience, 5 years. And the big question about 3, 4, or 5 years ago was, can you actually quantify uh, cybersecurity risk? And it's exciting time for us because the discussion, David, has really switched over to, well, of course you can, but how can you do it, and what method is the best and most appropriate way? And so today, we'll be looking at the two methods that are popularly in use. One is largely based at value at risk, and ours, which is an actuarial based approach to measuring and quantifying cybersecurity risk. So, David, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think Andrew, what we've seen is that we have had an entire period where the importance of cybersecurity risk has certainly grown exponentially in corporate America, particularly, and that's been over the last 10 to 15 years in the truest sense. But we honor that, and many of us, and I include myself as practicing CISO and CISSP, that we honor that, but what does that really mean? And so things kind of turned the corner, as you said, a number of years ago, more recently, towards we do need to quantify cybersecurity risk. Now, our corollary to that is sort of like any other operational area of the organization. So if we had somebody running a fleet of trucks, for example, well, it's pretty clear you'd want to know how many trucks are there, where are they located, what are they being used for, and maybe some additional things like how many trucks on average are out for maintenance and not operational on any given day. What is the maintenance turnover on those trucks? What's the cost of maintaining each truck on it? And so, if the person who runs the truck fleet is meeting with senior management or maybe even investors, shareholders, you'd want to be prepared to kind of speak to those parameters, right? And yet, all too often, and this is what fosters visibility, transparency, and all of those things around good governance. Let alone things like maybe you have to file, U.S. Department of Transportation paperwork or something, and they're going to need to know these kinds of answers. But
Yeah.
in cyber, it's really been a long time coming. And if you think about it, and I include myself in this, as cybersecurity professionals, our profession has really only been around maybe 20 years. When I was active duty military and running a data center on a nuclear missile base, we had certain cybersecurity protections in place, of course, thank goodness. But they weren't the level of sophistication that we have today, and we didn't have the threats that we have today either, for that matter. One of the things this is a little bit of an aside, but they used to brief us on, if you see a white van parked outside the base main gate, who knows? It could have electronics in it. There could be, EMP kinds of things that they could get latch onto, et cetera. But these are very rudimentary issues by today's standards. So, really our profession has only been around the last 15, 20 years. Now, medicine has been around as a profession all the way back to the time of Hippocrates and the Hippocratic Oath. And they've got standards and they for thousands of years and principles and basic ways that they operate. Not so much in cyber. So we're really kind of making that transition today, and we're a work in progress. Let's face it.
Sure.
So one of the things we want to focus on today is, well, how do you quantify cybersecurity risk? And further to your point, Andrew, I can remember the day when back not too long ago there was this kind of what now is a mythology around, Well, you can't possibly quantify cybersecurity risk. Everybody knows. Yeah, if somebody tries to quantify cybersecurity risk, well, that's just nonsense. And of course, there's never been a risk facing humanity that hasn't ultimately been able to be measured, quantified, projected, evaluated in some kind of a discipline. And a lot of those things go back to insurance-based disciplines because they live and die by risk. It's the only thing that they have in their entire business in the insurance industry to underwrite, and they just have to be right. So we'll
Sure.
talk a little bit about that today, but
Yeah,
back to you.
and David, I like kind of framing it through the maturation of our profession and kind of how industry leaders and governments are going about this today, right? I mean, you can only do so much when you had limitations back in the early days, and I think you're seeing that maturation occurring where there are techniques, there is the data, there is the ability to really get at this, but we aren't seeing all, we're starting to see adoption, and you can look at the market and see, right? We have chronic underinsurance. People are making poor decisions on how they're spending their money, you're led, and through our own client conversations, we hear this time and time again. Right? You're making decisions a lot of times solely based on professional judgment, expert opinion, that's not being afforded the ability to be directed by an understanding of where those dollars should be spent and what kind of dollars need to be spent in order to effectively protect an organization from this very dynamic, complex, and rapidly evolving risk. And so that ability to quantify it really does allow people to direct those resources where they need to go. And the other myth that's still out there, which I know, again, we'll be having this conversation a year from now or two, quantification of risk is not in any way a threat to where the CISOs are looking at getting and using their budget authorities. It's a way to secure more, to identify that return, and to direct it where it's most effective in protecting the organization, which at the end of the day is to reduce the likelihood or probability of a material loss, i.e. a financial impact. So exciting times, and we're seeing a lot more residents in the clients that we talk to, as well as just industry voices out there. So
And if you reflect on the all too common type of board meeting where cyber is reporting out and other functions of the company are reporting out, et cetera, you have this kind of thing. And I've been in board meetings with public companies and sat in on the discussion enough to see that you have the plant operations, maybe the COO kind of individual role sort of reports, and then here's our cost of maintenance, here's how much machinery we have in place, here's the level of production, our capacity, here's how much of the capacity we used this month, last month, et cetera. A lot of numbers that really provide the board members insights. Now, the average board member may not know how this widget stamping machine actually operates, right? But they don't need to know because they've got numbers and they've got insights. Then the CFO comes in. Of course, the CFO has, balance sheet, income statement, cash flow, dynamics, and variability around all of the above, and details at very ground level about things. Cybersecurity leader comes in, the CISO, and we now have, most organizations have that C-level title for the CISO, and yet they really can't yet all too often stand tall with their peers in the organization. The reason for that is they come in and they here's how many threats we had, here's how many vulnerabilities we extinguished, maybe something like that. But those are kind of the building blocks towards the ultimate measure of effectiveness, which is risk. What is our risk exposure? And traditionally, it's only been recently that there's been an increased focus on threats. So traditionally, most cybersecurity operations had a very, very strong and valuable, what I would say is necessary but not sufficient, focus on vulnerabilities. And that's fine. Now, that's one of the component parts. We were actually in a forum yesterday where the point was made that, well, look, if you're going to make a salad dressing, you need oil and vinegar. Now,
Hmm.
in theory, you could make a salad dressing that's all oil, right? I don't know who'd want to eat it. You could make one that's all vinegar. That'd be pretty bitter. You bring the two together, now you've got an actual salad dressing. So that's a very basic example of how we build towards risk. We have to get an understanding of risk, and risk has two essential components in cyber, that is threats and vulnerabilities. So if we understand vulnerabilities very, very well, but we don't understand a whole lot about threats, yeah, that's a very imbalanced kind of mix. And we won't be able to say a lot about risk as a result. So, these are very, very basic things. In our world, of course, there are four basic elements of cybersecurity and that accrue to risk, and that's threats, risks themselves, the vulnerabilities, and then capabilities. So capabilities are kind of upstream of that. The only thing I can really affect in that directly are capabilities. So I can acquire capabilities, expand them, repoint them towards other sorts of issues, and et cetera. But I can't really affect threats. Threats are going to come to me no matter what I do. So I really have to
Sure.
have this concept of preparedness and resilience that increasingly organizations are latching onto. But it's got to be embedded in an understanding of the problem. And that's where quantification gaps can be especially harmful, as we're seeing in recent events.
Oh yeah. I mean, look at. I mean, obviously, everyone on this call is probably well aware of what recently happened over at AT&T. I'm one of those. I mean, and I'm sure others on this call received an email over the past few days. 100 million at least of us did. I mean, the magnitude of those types of breaches and the cost in financial terms to AT&T, not just to mention the reputational harm, is it's just immense. Um, and we're, I mean, you can turn on, looking, even, daily. I mean, Bassett Furniture just had, all of their plant operations are down right now. These are real costs associated with the failure to properly manage these risks in an increasingly, again, complex and rapidly evolving threat landscape, no doubt.
Yeah, and you kind of have to start from a point of perspective that this is serious stuff. I mean, it's serious stuff, and as my old finance professor Richard Leftwich at University of Chicago used to ask all of us, well, but who cares? Who cares? Well, so it turns out a lot of people care. Shareholders certainly care, and you can
Sure.
see the AT&T attack and the effects of that, just reverberations in their share price afterwards. And boards care. They maybe should care more or care at a more detailed level. Certainly, they should care at a more quantified level. But stakeholders internally care, employees care because they're affected by these things. Regulators certainly care,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll make it known that they care because they'll show up on your doorstep. And many of these recent breaches have resulted in congressional inquiries. CEO is called to testify in front of Congress. I mean, how much more pressure and evaluation of these things from outside sources do we really need before we really start taking
Yeah,
it seriously?
and I mean, I'm sure you agree with me, David, on this. I mean, part of it is just this, and you see this across a lot of risk-related disciplines and fields, right? Which is just this risk-adverse feeling, right? Well, it's not going to happen to me. We're doing all we can. There's just this apathy out there, and what we're seeing is some of the big players in this space. I mean, MGM comes to mind, United Healthcare comes to mind. Um, People that you would assume are taking this very seriously, and I'm sure they are, but are not effectively, even with all the bright minds they have, being able to get their hands around that risk exposure. And so I do think apathy is probably the biggest challenge that businesses alone have in truly taking this risk seriously. I mean, wouldn't it be a much better world to sleep in if you were doing what you would be doing right a boom without having to go through the headache of lawsuits, congressional testimony in some cases,
Yeah.
SEC
Yeah.
or regulatory scrutiny, or just the embarrassment and reputational risk of a headline attack. If you were able to get to write a boom before and foregoing all of the painful steps necessary to where these organizations actually realize this is and give it the types of focus that this risk truly appreciates. And one way, of course, of doing that, I think, where we see at least with clients is once you put that dollar figure on there, and it's not just a technological issue. This is a true business issue. And when you're able to communicate that risk in obviously the language of business, which is economics and dollars and cents, you really are able to start breaking down silos and getting real work done towards managing this ever increasingly important risk to both the nation state as well as to businesses of the individual.
Yeah, the kind of embarrassing reality is that, we talk about cyber risk quantification as if it's a novelty, it's something that's emerging, which it sort of is, and we'll get into that here in a moment. But, just imagine if we were talking about how the finance function in the organization should start quantifying finance. Like if we started preaching the virtues, the benefits of financial quantification, so that when an organization can look at its debts, its liabilities, its revenues, and so on, oh, big news, those should be quantified in number terms, dollars and cents terms. Well, it'd be just patently ridiculous. And yet we somehow are accepting of this in cyber.
Yeah,
And you got to wonder, I mean, some of this consideration around, is the issue of cybersecurity really being treated seriously? Some of that may be that you do have directors who come from perhaps more of a traditional background, not maybe exposed to cybersecurity practice that much in their own careers.
yeah,
That may be a factor in this. It may be that through efforts like SEC and others, which are good efforts, that they've only recently ratcheted up the heat on these issues. I mean, SEC has been expecting since at least the 1930s very transparent reporting on the financial operations of the company, but only recently on the cybersecurity functions of the company. So, you can attribute it to some of that, but some slice of that issue of really focusing on cyber is probably a function of visibility. I mean,
yeah,
it's hard for me to focus on something that I can't see into at all.
yeah.
And,
I'd say visibility and actionability, David. Right? Not just that visibility, but the ability to take an appropriate action. And it looks
yeah,
like there's a question that just popped up regarding budget allocation or reallocation as an obstacle in pivoting towards a proper risk program. Right? I mean, I think that's part of what you're getting at, David. Right? Is that ability to have the visibility necessary to allocate the resources that that specific risk actually presents to
yeah.
the organization. You know.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and thanks for posing that. Because like, how do I know? How do I know where to point my efforts, my dollars and cents, my people in cybersecurity, et cetera, if I don't know which issues are contributing the most to risk? So I can be kind of reactive, and so much of cybersecurity from ages past has been, we've got a threat coming in on a port that's been left open. Well, let's shut that port down. Let's shut it down. Address the issue, or we've got a patch that is super critical now. Let's apply that patch, prioritize it. But what's really driving all of this? And
Yeah.
so, where we've seen organizations really be able to advance is in getting kind of a quantitatively driven or risk driven GPS, if you will, on their cybersecurity program that says, look, go here, apply the results here. This is the potential for risk reduction, and it's compelling enough that you really should make this a priority. And very few organizations in the past have taken that approach for a variety of reasons, but that now is where a lot of people are making ground. So we have
Sure.
customers that have gained back around upwards of 22 million in cybersecurity risk reduction, and at the same time been able to double their cybersecurity budget.
Yeah.
So all of this accrues to better protection, more security, and not a false sense of security anymore, but a solidly based realization that, as one CEO told us, I can really sleep at night now. And
Yeah.
that was a case where they had eradicated, in working with us over a number of years, over 95% of their cybersecurity risk exposure, which is
Yeah.
a beautiful place to be.
Yeah, and that's a great great result that this type of approach was able to bring to that organization. Just to go back to an earlier point you mentioned, David, there is a gap again on do we have a problem, right? Truly understanding that there is a risk. I think most people understand it, but it is, the leaders in this space from an enterprise perspective are folks that are looking at risk and to direct their cyber programs from a risk awareness perspective, right? Not just from a fix it, band-aid, or kind of hammer and nail approach, but how do we again match that tactical with the strategic, as we talked about last time, and really inform all of our decisions based on kind of the best risk information that we have, including the financial impact of our decisions and our exposure. But it's interesting. Our friends over at DDN, David, put an interesting analysis out on some current attempts by the federal government to mandate that there be some level of expertise at the board level, and it is astonishing the pushback. It's kind of hard to comprehend why an
It's sad.
organization would want to bring someone that has a unique perspective, more finely attuned to this very important risk, right? I mean, look at Bassett right now. They can take orders at their stores. They cannot fill those orders, and who knows how long that will be. And in fact, in their SEC filing, which is one of the first I've seen, and I'm sure there are others out there, they specifically say this attack's going to have a material impact on our business. They're not hiding from it. They're just accepting the reality that for whatever reasons it's occurred, they know that this is going to have a very big impact. And it will be interesting to watch how that impacts their stock
Yeah,
price.
and
And so there is this hesitancy to address.
yeah, you think about, well, what are the things we really care about as a business? Well, the ability to be in business has to be one of them, and
Yeah,
sustain
should be.
operation.
Yeah,
I mean, who
right.
who needs that explained to them at a fundamental level? And so we got our hands on a what is a very interesting piece that appeared in Forbes. I think actually late last week. I'm seeing a
Yeah,
July 13th date on this. So we'll share this here, and that is and let's see, get the share going correctly here. Um, that was from Noah Barsky, and Noah is an academic. We've had some conversation with him since this piece was published, but you've got I mean, kind of hot title, if you will, of this thing, which is AT&T board gifted 100 million customers privacy to hackers. Now, this one is interesting because it wasn't just kind of PCI or credit card records that has happened in earlier breaches. This was the actual text messages and phone calls of and voicemails of individual AT&T customers. It's a massive
Yeah,
amount of data,
yeah,
and
David. I mean,
it's
yeah,
just wild.
yeah. we were talking before the call. I received one of those letters. Fortunately for me, it's mainly going to be bad baby photographs and grocery list and that kind of stuff. But when I worked for the government, AT&T was our carrier, and this was back many years ago. But you can think about the number of sensitive types of communications that are captured in this.
Yeah,
And of course, with things like OMB hacks, et cetera, and the ability now through computing, the ability for very sophisticated threat actors to use this type of information to target individuals, to extort them, blackmail, et cetera, alone is, I mean, is terrifying. And I think a lot of folks who have been following this since the first rumors of it, I think AT&T spent a lot of time trying to get a national security exclusion for this in some of their disclosures of it. So,
yeah,
this is terrifying, frankly, right? And I think will have far-reaching impacts on that business moving forward. I mean, I personally am, it will probably move carriers because of it. I think it's an
yeah.
unacceptable level of risk to be attached to someone who has a security culture that allows something like this to occur. It's too much.
Absolutely. And when you have Brian Krebs commenting on your cybersecurity practices, that
Yeah,
there is holding companies accountable for sloppy security practices. Well, he's a pretty credible authority out there, and it's really a sad state of affairs. And this is it comes back to the board. It comes back to what you said a moment ago about what is the expertise on the board around cybersecurity, and who's really advising them.
yeah,
And it's just this is there's so many organizations that are set up for a similar kind of outcome, and it's really
yeah.
too bad.
And keep wondering when, right? This is going to be that one attack that pushes everyone into the camp of, wow, we got to take this a bit more seriously, not just vocally, but putting kind of action to that that's meaningful and sustainable. I do think that we're seeing, obviously, our U.S. government, some foreign governments that are friendly to the U.S., really starting to take this threat seriously. Way too late in the game, but making some real pushes toward to force both with carrot and stick, but realizing they're going to have to use more stick than carrot to get these enterprise and organizations to actually go out there and do meaningful things to protect consumers, government clients, et cetera. And when will that big tipping point be, David? I have to think it's soon. I mean, this year alone, or if you kind of move into like a 12-month period. I mean, we had Move It, we've had SolarWinds, we've had United Healthcare, with MGM. The list of the risk deniers or the folks that were underprepared for the magnitude, again, of extreme risk, which we'll get into when we start talking about value at risk versus an actuarial approach to quantifying this. That ability to really look at, which is where we're all here to do, is to try to prevent a low probability, high impact event. And we're seeing some of those out there in the headlines today. So with
Yeah, and we've had the opportunity to interact with a number of not just cybersecurity thinkers of really great insights, like Rick Howard and others, but also business analysts and commentators and researchers and so on. And one of them I just wanted to highlight because it's endemic to cybersecurity that I know a lot of boards have respect for him, and that's Aswath Damodaran. And when you are considered and introduced regularly on outlets like CNBC and Bloomberg and so on as the dean of valuation. And what's more dear and near to any organization commercially than valuation, the very value of the enterprise itself? So what Demoderan has weighed in on here is that there are really only three things that contribute to corporate value. One is the ability to generate cash flows. Second is the expected growth in those cash flows. And then the third thing that he's highlighting here is the uncertainty associated with these cash flows. Well, number one and number three are directly related to cybersecurity and can be eroded by cybersecurity. You know, you could be going along happy and proud and generating cash flows. Look at, you know, a long time icon of American business, AT&T. And then it turns out one day that your ability to generate additional cash flows has been harmed by something that happened apparently out of the blue, but that in retrospect you were exposed to. And
Yeah,
so then the uncertainty around cash flows is impacted by cybersecurity in a great degree. Now, how many organizations understand what a major cyber event would do to A, their ability to generate cash flows fundamentally, and then B, the uncertainty around those cash flows? And so my expectation is that the uncertainty of AT&T's cash flows is greater today than it was 2 weeks ago.
sure.
And the market, according to DeModern, he's very well respected. He's on the faculty at NYU Stern, and we've had conversations with him in the past that he is very, very focused on this. And look, do you care about your valuation? Again, this question of who cares about all this stuff? Well, you know, a lot of people care, and certainly shareholders care, and they will vote with their dollars and their feet on any of these issues. So that is, I think, a business perspective on. And we talk about there's a lot of chatter these days about, well, cybersecurity should be more aligned with the business and so on. And the fact is, this is how we get aligned. We focus on the business dynamics related to cybersecurity. We focus on value, and we focus on the numeric and dollars and cents impacts of cybersecurity risk and of what we're going to do about them.
Yep. Well said, David. Well said. And I think that kind of leads us into, well, if you were going to do this, right, how would you go about it? And again, I think there are these tool sets out there now that just did not exist. And again, a very new field, historically speaking, that can really, really advance this risk management cause within an organization, allow them to engage across the silos of an organization, to defend budgets, to explain why those budgets are necessary, to show the return on the investment, and most importantly, to direct the strategic nature of what all risk management, needs to be focused at, which is reduction of exposure to risk. And so, I think people are starting to open their eyes. I know particularly organizations, again, that are risk mature, that are to take this risk seriously, are thirsty for the ability, again, to bring this into to focus.
Yeah, and if you look at a kind of real basic level of this, and how do we really go about protecting myself? And I think probably everyone here on the call understands this implicitly, but just to kind of share our viewpoint on it, is that you've got some very basic things that can be put in place that, look, if even in today's world, even if I buy a router off the shelf from Cisco or Juniper or somebody, it's got a certain level of cybersecurity built into it. Okay, so I'm kind of starting to operate down at this level, and unfortunately, a lot of SMBs are kind of stuck at this level where maybe they've eradicated, say, 30% of their potential cybersecurity risk. But then from there, there's some basic things that I can do around what we might consider like hygiene factors around policies, training, processes, email filtering, et cetera, basic access control. And that'll get me to maybe another 20, 23% or so of my cyber risk being eradicated. But then from there, I've got to do a few more, perhaps somewhat more sophisticated things around MFA and getting my patch management program in place, getting a SIM system, maybe having a cybersecurity operations center, doing pen testing on a regular basis, that'll carve out another maybe 17% of the total that I'm exposed to. So, now I'm really starting to get down to something here. But to get from there, I have to really kind of amp up my cybersecurity measures and get to things like endpoint monitoring, staff training, a real true zero trust program that says essentially threats can come not just from the outside, but from the inside as well. And I've got to treat that accordingly. And from there, I've really got to now I've got about 18% of my cyber risk that remains unsolved for if you add this 8% of the 10%. And I've got to get down to things like cyber insurance. If I've gotten this far, great, more power to you. But now I really need to consider attack surface management, containerization, taking my data sets so that they're basically walled off from one another. They're segmented, et cetera. And then from there to really gain anything further, I've got to do some fairly sophisticated things. And this is where AI is currently helping us in particular around, looking at IoT space, pattern analysis around endpoint behavioral analytics. When are people logging in? Is there unusual activity that doesn't fit a normal pattern, and so on? So really, this is not a process for amateurs by any means, and most CISOs are able to guide the ship towards these kinds of accomplishments. But what actually happens is, because let's face it, some of the basic protections here are relatively cheap, actually. So everyone should actually be doing these. Some of the stuff, as you kind of move up the stack, if you will, it becomes a little more pricey, a little more expensive. And this is really where senior management does want to see, and the board particularly, what am I
Am I
really
getting?
getting these things,
Yep.
And as a CISO, and I've been in these meetings time and again, it's really inadequate to say, well, you're getting endpoint behavioral analytics, you're getting better situational awareness across the domain. This is not stuff. I mean, we're excited about this kind of thing as CISOs, but it's not the kind of stuff that's going to light the fires of management and get them to start funding this stuff. What they want to know is they want to see what are the results of doing this stuff. We don't care how fancy and sophisticated and ornate it is. We want to know what it's going to do for the business. And again, going back to Demoderan's comments, is it going to reduce the
Mm-hmm.
uncertainty around our cash flows? Is it going to help us preserve our cash flows? Those are pretty
Yep.
basic things. So, but the disconnect here is that all too often, as a CISO, as a cybersecurity group, you're not really able to demonstrate adequately to senior management what this stuff does, what they get, and what they get is not a CSOC. It's not, a fancy bunch of screens showing alert feeds and things like that. That doesn't float their boat, to borrow a phrase. What they want to know is, what does this do for the business? And this is the massive disconnect in corporate America today.
Yeah. Yeah. You nailed it, David. And again, and you think about it at that level too. They're looking at all sorts of trade-offs. And so the organization that can't come in there and show a clear picture of both the cost, benefit, and return of certain investments is going to be somewhat disadvantaged, right? Particularly if you're in an environment with with tight resources or a scarcity of resources, right? That ability to make the compelling uh, argument, one that is risk informed and shows that it can inform that trade-off discussion, really does put everyone in a better position to make the types of resource, to that question earlier, the reallocation or the allocation of the resources necessary, to prepare for, prevent, and respond to, the unlikely or the likely event of some sort of incident occurring. So, yeah, very
Exactly.
well said. And so, I mean, so David, maybe if you want to give us some thoughts again. I think we should. We're kind of pushing into 20 minutes left. There are two different real approaches right now in the market that are in use, right? Of how can we get that types of information to a CISO or to a board or to the organization as a whole. And that really comes down to the two camps that I introduced the discussion around, which are the value at risk models out there, which are very controversial, frankly, and we'll get into a bit of that. Versus, the actuarial principles that our model is based on, as well as the entire insurance industry, bases their practice for hundreds of years on. Do you want to give any thoughts that kind of tee that up? And then I'd like to kind of look at the two things that I'd look at when I look at VAR are the limitations to that, and then the dangers of those limitations when it comes to effective risk management. I'd also like then we can discuss a bit about what actuarial science can provide to address both those limitation issues and some of the risk inherent in basing risk management off of a VAR model.
Yeah, no, I think, we really kind of started this journey as sponsored by U.S. Strategic Command in 2017. And what STRATCOM and U.S. Cyber Command were really looking to achieve was to understand, as we look at and evaluate certain strategies, even solutions, and we brought in Darktrace and ForcePoint into this effort as well. The whole project was run by Kellogg Brown and Root, and MITRE Corp and Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab worked alongside ArxNimbus, but we were commissioned to create the core evaluative model around this. And so at a very basic level, what you see is, look, you've got to understand threats and vulnerabilities, as we said earlier, but you also need to understand historical loss patterns. And without that, which this value at risk model has very little emphasis on, that you're really kind of lost, because these are the patterns. So if you think about it, in other areas of risk in society, think about when you take that Geico challenge, 20 minutes and you'll save 20% on your car insurance. What do they really ask? What do they ask? Well, they ask, what zip code do you live in? What kind of car do you drive? How many miles a year do you put on? And what's your accident history? And certain things like that. So they have a model sitting behind the scenes that basically takes your data and it chunks through it against the historical loss patterns of others. And they try to develop a cross correlation as best they can, et cetera. And it's been proven over many, many decades in the, I guess, nearly 100 years now in the car insurance business, that will produce a valid picture of risk, enough so that they can quote you a premium, and the premium can be a reflection of your risk. So think about that. If you think about, well, you can't quantify risk, well, they're quantifying risk all the time. And there's nothing that's that much less complex about automotive risk. Think of the variables. Just look out on the local street corner and the cars that are driving crazy and people cutting each other off. And we've all seen it. We've all experienced it. It's common experience. But how do you, in that environment, portray risk? Different driver skill levels, this sort of. But they're able to do it. They're able to do it. So this is not an insurmountable challenge. And then we found also that financials are very important here. So we scrape company financials all the time. We work with SEC Edgar as the database of record for public companies, and then have a variety of data sets for private companies. And then benchmarks. Benchmarks are also important. So how does this relate to my peers? And the auto insurance example is driven by benchmarks as well, because what is the accident history of people living in my same zip code? And is there something adverse that's going on there? Maybe there's a bad freeway interchange right near me, or who knows what, that's causing an accident frequency to spike up in some fashion. So you take all of that together, and that's really what's necessary to build a proper model around this. And the kind of things that we've done, have been pretty well vetted, and we use actuarial science. We've been covered by peer-reviewed papers from FSA actuaries, economists, et cetera. We apply machine learning models and AI models to evaluate it. And it all results in kind of a curve like this, which is a negative binomial distribution. So what we're really interested in cyber, of course, is the very low probability of a very catastrophic loss.
Yeah,
And
and this is kind of, David, to your point, this is really where, when you look, and for people that aren't as familiar with the value risk model, it's been in kind of wide use since the 90s. It's heavily credited, by the way, with being responsible for for the 2008 financial collapse, as well as some issues in the late 1990s. And actually Nassim uh, Nicholas Taleb, he argued voraciously before Congress to outlaw them all. Now, why is that so? I think one of those is, it looks at risk on a normal distribution, and proponents of the value risk model will say, well, no, we've adjusted for that, and we can do a bunch of. But at its core, right, it's looking at risk um, on a normal distribution, right, David? The second, like, I guess that you have is the slide up that we can go through, but it's very, very limited in its functions, and for good reason, which we can jump into a bit here. I'll let you have that slide up now. We can kind of go through that.
yeah, so I mean, Taleb is a very respected observer around risk management approaches, especially in financial markets. And of course, one of the things that happened here with value at risk, or a FAIR model, as it's called in cybersecurity, is, and it came out of World Economic Forum, and all due respect to those guys. And at the time, there was a very thin set of data that we had around cybersecurity losses. So we get it. I mean, it was the only thing available at the time, and that's fine. And like so many things in technology and society, there's a progression, right? So you have at one point there's not a lot of data available. At another point, there's more data, and then we get more sophisticated over time. So this was in certain measures kind of a stopgap. It also probably a decade before it emerged in cybersecurity, it was a stopgap in the mortgage banking sector.
Yep.
And so Taleb issued many of the quotes kind of here in the middle are those that he actually published in about 1996, believe it or not, warning a lot of us about this. I mean, please don't drive a school bus blindfolded.
Yeah.
And we don't want to do anything like that in cybersecurity. It's not a great place to do it, of course. It is. Very, and he describes it as aggressive ignorance and so on. And Taleb has some very disparaging comments about it. There actually was testimony in Congress after the global mortgage crisis asking that and promoting that value at risk and the FAIR model be outlawed in the United
Yep.
States. And of course, the bitter thing, and if you want to see a great film about this, it's The Big Short. And so it's a story about largely Michael Burry in the film, and it's a true story. Was a physician, but he was also a trader at the time, and really caught on to the fact that this value at risk or FAIR model was producing some uh, false sense of security on the part of lenders, and they were lending into this thing, and a lot of them were using it at the time. So it was sort of a groupthink effect as well that caused an overconfidence among mortgage lenders. And of course, we all know how that ended. It was trillions of wealth, trillions of dollars of wealth that were wiped out. And I remember a little personal story about that. I remember I was actually at ground zero with my daughter around the time that this was happening. And this was we did the whole walk around the old World Trade Center site, and at that time, the wreckage was still sticking out, and so on, and NYPD was everywhere, and so on. We got around the block to Lehman Brothers, and I noticed something. Now, this was by the time we had finished dinner in the East Village and been over there, and I noticed that there's all kinds of people coming out of Lehman and going in and out. So they're all wearing suits. A lot of them are carrying bankers boxes, and so I'm thinking, 11:30 at night. Why is all this commotion going on at Lehman? And of course, it was like the next day or two that the news came out that Lehman had failed. It had blown up. Other organizations, if you remember, AIG actually was teetering on the brink and
Oh
required
yeah.
federal support in order to be saved, or the entirety of AIG, largest insurer at the time, would have gone down worldwide. It just very, very, really difficult
And,
time, horrendous results. And so,
but
this is, and Taleb was warning us the whole time.
yeah, and not just Taleb. I mean, David Einhorn is a famous debate there. I mean, he echoes these points, and we can go through. There's a list of accredited economists, quant guys. I mean, yeah, professors at Oxford, et cetera, who all kind of come down to basic things, which is there's limitations there. There's as David Einhorn said, it creates this false sense of security, right? Which we saw. I mean, we lived all through it, and the impacts that had, and without some dramatic actions, the entire economy was put at risk.
Right.
So it is curious, right? And so let's go into some of those risks, David. And I think behind this collapse, right, which are the limitations and the dangers of R, which are value risk. It's the model risk, which is heavily based on assumptions, right? And that don't accurately always reflect the real world. And so again, this creates this false sense of security. It creates groupthink in a lot of ways within organizations. It doesn't necessarily look and is able to capture these fat tail, high impact, low probability events, which is what we're worried about. I mean, let's just use AT&T as an example. Big events. That's what we should
Yeah.
all be protecting against. When you're an organization, you can absorb some of these smaller incidents, but what you want to be doing is planning for these high impact, low probability events. It does not effectively capture that. I think that's what all of these individuals, Andrew Lowe, over at MIT, great quant guy out there, would echo these. And even, and so you can say, well, that's economist. In cyber, it's all different, right? But let me give you a quote I found earlier today from Dan Greer, right? Now, who's Dan Greer? Dan Greer is a renowned security researcher, cyber risk analyst. He's a CISO for an organization called NQTEL, which is the CIA's venture capital arm. So this is the guy that's looking at what are we going to arm our future spies and warriors with, and how does he look at this? And he says the challenge with fair or value at risk is that it can give a false sense of certainty, right? Everyone out there is looking at this, and it is curious to us again. Why would you be employing something that carries with this risk? Again, there's model risk, there's the inability for fat tails or extreme events, which we talked about, and there's, I think, most importantly, there's this lack of its ability to capture granularity, which is super important when you're thinking about the complexities of cyber risk, right? So it provides more of a broad estimate without looking at that kind of detail level, which is about identifying and mitigating specific cybersecurity threats. So David, on those kind of thoughts, I think your insight into this would be helpful as well.
Yeah, and I think it kind of comes back to the Taleb comment that, if you are flying an aircraft and it has an altimeter that only works 50% of the time, you're going to crash. I mean, ultimately, there's no possible outcome other than if you fly this thing long enough that it's going to crash.
Yeah, well,
And
David
you know,
Einhorn famous quote. Yeah, it's like having bars like having an airbag that works all the time. Expect when you get in an accident. So,
yeah,
you know,
right, yeah, and
like,
it looks great until the time that you really need it, and there's difficulty, and that's really kind of what uh, showed up in the global mortgage crisis,
yeah,
because it wasn't until there was turbulence and due to kind of Fed policy and interest rate fluctuations and things, it started to produce some disturbances in that market. And then the whole thing came collapsing in. It
Sure.
reminds me of this great quote by Warren Buffett that, it's only when the tide goes out that you're able to see who's been swimming naked.
Yeah.
And it's that
Yeah.
kind of thing. People put it in place. They have all kinds of justifications for it, and they're using it. And there's a lot of PR around it and that kind of thing. But it's not.
Yeah.
It's
So,
it's very dangerous. So if nothing
yeah.
else, if we can warn people off of that, that's a good
Yeah.
public service.
Yeah.
At
Yeah.
least
Dave, I know we got
examine
5 minutes.
it.
Yeah, I know we got 5 minutes left here, real quick. So just to be conscious of time, we've talked about the reason for why would you need quantification. I think we've hit on, I think, some of the higher points about the two models. There's the value at risk and some of the limitations and dangers of that. Maybe it would be helpful for the group just to real quickly look at, well, what's the other side of this equation, and how does actuarial cyber risk quantification, the use of a proven mathematical based way to manage risk, and again, there's a whole industry based out of it. Why is that a preferred approach when we're looking at cyber risk? And how does it address some of those limitations? It might be a good place to kind of steer the
Yeah.
discussion in the remaining time.
Well, and really what you want is, and I had shared this slide earlier, but just as context, I think I may have been kind of not quick enough on the uptake to get this out there. But this is kind of the approach that conforms to actuarial science and also operates within the parameters of NIST. So, you think about in cybersecurity practice, we have, the accountants, again, maturity of our profession, right? The accountants have generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP. Engineers have very sound principles worked out over time. It's why we can have confidence that we invest in a company because there's GAAP. We have confidence we're going to be able to drive over a bridge and it's not going to collapse because of engineering standards. So this is the kind of thing that we need to do more of in cybersecurity as the profession matures. Now, all throughout history, actuarial science, starting in, believe it or not, the 1600s, has been the place you go as a society to understand risk. So it's everything from
Yeah.
shipping risk to even life insurance risk. Actuarial tables are really a cornerstone there. And things like property and casualty risk, malpractice, even in the medical arena. All of these things are made understandable in financial terms by actuarial science. And
Yeah.
so you take actuarial practices as outlined in this paper is one example it's a peer-reviewed paper produced by University of Illinois on our actual methodology, 47 pages, and we're happy to share that with whoever after the call, or if you'd like to learn more, just ping us. We can provide that. We do machine learning evaluations and AI-driven evaluations of the model, see what the variability is with primarily our T-score, which is our central measure of things. And then, all of this sits on the foundation of actual losses that have been documented. And the good news, and this is one of the reasons why now it's possible to produce these results, is with recent SEC rulings and things, we're getting a lot more data now on actual losses. And so we can
Yep.
see into this. And we use 22 different data sources to populate this model. We're adding additional data sources all the time. It's really just, it's a function of taking the way that society has managed risk in other arenas that's been proven, putting that on top of the NIST frameworks, which are the most solid source of cybersecurity practices that are out there, and then producing a model that can be back tested and is producing results like this, prediction of a year
Yep.
prior of the Change Healthcare loss, which is now coming to fruition.
Yeah. No, David, I think on those points, one of the things that I think really stands out when you compare the two is that, an actuarial approach is able to consider a wide range of factors, right? So you talked about historical losses, but also frequency, severity, that potential financial impact, right? And it allows a lot more adaptability and flexibility than a value at risk model, right? It's based on probability
Right.
and statistical modeling that limit those model risks that are at the core of I think the risk to at a value at risk model. But it also allows tailored measurement, right? Risk measurement, which I think is super important to at least the clients that we use. So, and then also as you hit on there, the last point, it marries up really, really nicely with frameworks. And the value at risk model can't do that. You see a lot of people trying to force a value at risk model into a risk framework, and they just really don't add up. It's really as a pushing it in,
No.
scround, round hole, square peg kind of thing.
Yeah, and I know we're
So
over time
I,
here, but the other point on that to sum it up is that it takes out the professional opinion and expert judgment that are a significant dependency in that value at risk fair model. That it makes it a data driven approach, real losses, real risks in the real world, and that's just a much better basis for
Sure, and it
results.
allows you to look outward too, and to look at systemic risks in a way that again, you really can't capture in that value at risk mindset.
Right.
So, whether someone uses us or not, I think there are true pitfalls, again, identified by leading economists, cybersecurity experts, that are just inherent in that model. And not that it didn't help pioneer and push us into a more risk aware universe, but we have the data, the process, and the outputs necessary today to really take an outdated model that carries with it risk, and at the time was able to offset the risk that it carries with it by providing additional visibility to a modern approach based on actuarial science and math. Right? It's not magic, as one of our team members often says. It's not magic, it's math, and that's able to give a much more clear and acute picture of risk, as well as the ability to manage that risk going forward. So,
Yeah, and we sorely need that today. We need to advance and get better at this as a profession, and so we're here to empower that.
well, thank you everyone for taking the time today. We appreciate it, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to David, myself, or a member of our team. And we're happy to have a discussion about, again, the differences between value at risk and ACRQ, as well as what we might be able to bring your organization. So, thank you again,
Excellent.
and
Thank you.
look forward to seeing you next